Welcome to the TDS Early Years podcast. Now, each week we're going to be joined by different educational experts from across the globe who are going to offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help us as practitioners unlock all the potential for learning that there is in the early years. So to be first to hear about future episodes and to access all of the follow-up content, including ideas for your own setting, Pinterest, mood boards, and loads more, you can sign up for exclusive access using the link in our podcast description. Hello everybody, my name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg and I am your host for this week's TDS Talking Early Years podcast, and I'm an early years consultant, trainer and author. The first series of the TDS Talking Early Years podcast aims to explore the amazing adventures that children can have in outdoor learning in the early years. And I'll be talking to a number of global experts that we aim to use their knowledge to inspire your everyday work and unlock the potential of all of the great things that you do in your early years settings. During today's episode, we're going to be introducing the concept of risky play in the early years, which I know is a big one for lots of us. And we're going to be trying to unpick what it is, how we can recognize it, and how we can use it to its full potential. And to join me to delve into that subject, I am delighted to introduce Ellen Sandseter, who is today's guest. Hello, Ellen.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for being here. I am actually a huge fan of your work, so I am a little bit fanboying at the moment. It's going to be a pleasure to spend the next few minutes discussing your work around risky play. But for anybody that hasn't come across your work, could you just tell us a little bit about you, who you are and what you do?
Well, I am a professor within early childhood education in Norway, Trondheim in Norway, working at the Department of Physical Education and Health here. So I'm actually becoming preschool teachers or early childhood teachers. And my main, interest within research is risky play and children's risk-taking in play. So I have been trying to, see the positive side of children taking risks and not to, overprotect them.
Throughout this episode, we are going to be sharing our thoughts and some ways of maybe creating a more relaxed approach to risky play in the early years. Because sometimes it's about us as practitioners not feeling very relaxed, but also usually we're working in a team and usually there'll be some sort of leadership or management team that we're also, as well as parents, responsible to. So have you got any thoughts or any nuggets or strategies that have worked effectively, Ellen, that you think would be useful to pass on?
Well, first of all, as I also mentioned in the other episode, was that you need practitioners and teachers that have experiences from risk and outdoor play maybe and things like that themselves, and also experiences and competencies and skills that will actually make the practitioners comfortable of being outdoors and letting children take risks. And also I think it's important for practitioners and teachers to try to remember how the feeling that they had when they were children and when they were able to take a risk, and the thrill and excitement and the really, really strong feeling of mastery that they get when they handle things like that. I think it's important that we're not forgetting that. And if you're not, if you're living in a country or a context where teacher training don't include skills like that, so you're not, having that within your training, I think it's important for staff in preschools and childcare centers to actually provide that to themselves. So to go outdoors, I mean, even as an adult, why don't you climb a tree and to see how that feels with your staff members, and maybe practice on making a fire outdoors, or whatever, to have more experience yourself. So that's I think it's a really important point, because I've been working in projects where other European, more safety obsessed countries try to learn from the Norwegian and Scandinavian way of doing it, but it's like they're missing. They don't have the experience space. We're talking about children's experience space, which is so important. But if adults don't have that experience space, it's really, really difficult also. And a child will notice if you're afraid. A child will notice if you don't feel comfortable, or if you don't like to be outside or outdoors when it rains, for instance. So you will influence the children also by just being who you are, and
I think we do that both consciously and subconsciously, and I think you're dead right in that we look at other nations and their views on early childhood education, and often what we try and do is lift a philosophy or an ethos and then drop it into a different culture. And I mean, even around things like the Reggio approach, there are elements that will work, but there are elements that don't work because it's the cultural expectation is different. So you're right. I think one of the things you have to do if you're going to kind of take the essence is also look at the kind of culture around where you're dropping that in. And, I love the idea of, I mean, how exciting would a staff meeting be? And rather than doing a really boring paper-based exercise or watching some online training, you could go and climb a tree and make a fire. That would be a really good staff meeting.
And the next step is then to do it with the children. So that you also get knowledge about each child's competence. Because I think to be able to, be more relaxed about what children are doing and exploring, you need to know their competencies. And that's also what I mentioned before. I'm kind of opposing age appropriate. I would rather say competence appropriate. And to be able to have a practice that and a pedagogy that is more focused on competency appropriate rather than age appropriate, you need to know children as a teacher. You need to know if this child is a sensation or risk seeker. You need to know if how high up in a tree is this child, competent to climb. So you need to know your children, easily said. So, and to be able to know each child, you need to be active with them. So the next step would be to climb a tree with the children, or at least be very close to them and be together with them while they're doing this.
Which allows you to observe. I think the big thing is you get to know your children by watching them and creating a space that's very controlled, a bit like we talked about in the last episode about taking indoor things outside and making it quite small and controlled. You limit your view. When you're in a space that's way more open with more opportunities for interpretation, you see more because there's more opportunities for more to happen. And then as an adult, you can scaffold, you can watch, you can support, and you can challenge yourself, as we've talked about, and that kind of, where your anxiety level sits in terms of the risks that children are prepared to take. But you're dead right. It's to really facilitate a space that's really going to support children risk-taking. We as adults have to create that space or the beginnings of that space. And I think the other thing we have to be really good at is allowing children to take ownership. Because again, sometimes we can be a little bit, if we're being led by learning or objectives or outcomes, you're kind of like, I've created this activity or I've created this opportunity and I want it to stay like that. But a lot of risk for children comes when you say, I'm going to take a bit of that and I'm going to take a bit of that and I'm going to take it over here and then I'm going to add it to that. And for an adult, that can be a little bit unsettling if you've created a space linked to particular learning. But actually, if you can be a little bit more relaxed in that approach and observe and be happy to see what happens, you'll see that a lot more of the large and small risk-taking happens in that more open-ended space.
And also you have to have the parents on board. And if you've been together with the children, if you're comfortable yourself with risks and being outdoors, and you have been together with the children so that you actually know the children and their competencies, talking to the parents, you would be much more also like competent as a teacher or a practitioner to actually communicate both that you know about the child's skills and competencies, you know what they're able to do, you also know what they like to do and when they're happy. And you could also communicate and discuss with parents about the benefits of children's risk-taking in play, and where they could also be, invited into the discussion on where to draw the line, or what level of risk do we allow for your kid. But then it would be based on more than anxiety. It would be based on what's best for the child, for his or her experiences, what's best for his or her development, what is acceptable within the competencies of the child that we actually have observed and that we know. So it would be a more knowledge-based discussion and decision than rather being, overly focused on your own anxiety for a child breaking a leg or whatever.
I think another thing I've seen work really effectively was actually a setting in Australia where they have kind of bush schools for the very young children, where they're literally out in the bush, where there might be spiders and snakes, and they go down to the creek and all sorts of things that literally I think would make a lot of practitioners in other countries' hair stand on end. The fact that these very young children were very independent in this space. Yeah. But what they did was a lot of talking to the children about things like fire making, things like going into the kind of the creek. And they would say, what do you like about it? What do you enjoy? And they would say to the children, what do you do that keeps you safe? And what have you learned? And listening to 4-year-olds talking about, well, I know that if this happens, then that happens, so I don't do that. And then I always make sure that. And so what the adult basically did was get the children to peer tutor each other around their experience of risk. Yeah. So when they all went back into the space, and they did this on a regular basis, they were constantly just reaffirming each other's kind of safety criteria. And it meant that, the children were really bold and really explorative in the space, but also safe, because they'd had lots of discussions facilitated by an adult about not restricting you, but what can keep you safe in this space.
Yeah. And that's also really important, because when you're expressing it, you are more also aware of it. It's not just tacit knowledge, also within a child. So, and you can learn from putting it into words in a way.
Yeah, and I think what also amazed me about some of the work I saw out there was how independent the children were, because that's just always had as they'd been. So I'd again watched 2 boys, I think one was 4 and one was 5, who went and got a kind of dry kindling and put it in a sieve, because that's what they had. They had a flint, which you had to strike, which was quite difficult in terms of manipulation. They struck the flint. They'd actually got some cotton wool balls that they dipped into Vaseline, which are always done independently of an adult. Adults were around, but nobody was sitting next to them in kind of fireproof visor and a chainmail glove. Mm. And the children kind of got these cotton wool balls to light. Then they lit the kind of kindling, and then they got a stick and some tin foil, and they molded the end of the tin foil to look a little bit like a spoon. And they had some giant chocolate buttons, and they were melting chocolate buttons in their homemade spoon over their fire. And if they'd left that fire, it would have burned out in about 1 minute, 2 minutes, but they kept feeding it until they'd melted the chocolate buttons, then licked them off the spoon. And I just remember really being just amazed at the fact that 2 early years children were independently making a fire, but also all of the skills that they'd employed to create that. And then they had the chocolate buttons, and then the fire went out, then they put sand on top of the fire, and then they moved on and their play shifted. But it felt like I just fancied a chocolate button, so that's what I did. It wasn't like, today we're going to make a fire. Now, it might have started like that, but it got so familiar in their practice that they were just doing it safely.
And I think that's also really important, because sometimes you like, at least typically with outdoor play, parents or people really focusing on learning would say, but they're just playing, they're just roaming around. But examples like that actually shows how much learning there is. And I mean, I've been observing a lot of risky play among preschoolers, and trying to manage a risk is also like really advanced problem solving. And this is also what you're describing. It's problem solving. And I've seen so many episodes with children with really, really, advanced problem solving exploration. They don't know how to handle it. They don't know how to solve it, but together they actually find solutions. And the learning in that, I mean, that would be really high above the preschool curriculum.
Well, yeah, you can often say to some adults, would you like to light a fire? And they wouldn't know where to start. Never mind. I think the other thing that was interesting about that particular project was some of those boys in this instance had been talked about in a fairly negative way around their learning behaviors. So they would disrupt, they would roll around on the carpet, they would stand outside of the group and were difficult for adults to manage. And when they were given a different experience of learning, which was way more developmentally appropriate to where they were, all of those behaviors disappeared, because actually it wasn't about the children and their inappropriate behavior. It was about the opportunities they were given for their typical stage of development and their competencies which they needed to explore.
And that's also really important, because children are, as I said many times, children are different, and children also learn differently. So it's not one size fits all, but we adults seem to think that sometimes. So we have curriculum, and we're having thoughts about how all the children are going to learn the same thing through one learning activity, but that usually doesn't happen.
It's impossible. I think a lot of, again, it's to do with curriculums and governments and society, but we think a lot about compliance being really important. So if you're a teacher and you can get your children to sit nicely and show compliance, it means that you must be good at what you do because they comply. And actually, lots of learning doesn't come out of compliance, especially in early education, but you will get high levels of compliance if they're linked to high levels of engagement.
Yep.
And we know that risky play, or opportunities to take risk in play, brings high levels of engagement and releases of dopamine and all sorts of really good stuff that means that children emotionally connect with learning in a really positive and powerful way, rather than being sitting on a carpet, wriggling about with a numb bottom, feeling really miserable, and connecting with education in a really negative way. Yeah. So I think a lot of what we've talked about in all of the sessions that we've done is really, we've called it risky play, but a lot of it is just about how biologically human children are programmed to learn.
Yeah.
And what we just need to give them is more of what human beings need to learn and less of what society has evolved into how we think children should effectively learn, which is not really sitting on their bottoms on a mat in a circle for long periods of time.
No. And I think what I'm, concerned about is that the body, in a way, is slowly being removed from the early childhood education, centers and preschools. So it's a shift towards more learning. And when people then are talking about learning, it's the cognitive way of learning. So as you say, sitting on their butts instead of learning with their whole bodies. And I think we're moving in a terribly wrong direction if we think that is the way to go with at least the younger children.
I think, unfortunately, we're getting to the end of this particular episode, but I would urge anybody that hasn't come across your work before or who would like to revisit that to go and do that. And I mean, hopefully we'll be able to give some references in the follow-up material that we put out. But I would just say, in the modern age, just Google you. And if you Google you get everything from academic papers to little videos you can watch on YouTube, but all of them really informative and reinforcing all of the things we've talked about, not only in this episode, but in all of the others. I mean, as always, these episodes are just way too short. We could literally spend an hour on each one. Some more fascinating insights and some really practical tips around how you can begin that process of making your environment one that's promoting risk in a positive way and how that benefits children. So once again, Ellen, thanks for some more brilliant insights.
Thanks for having me.
All it leaves me to do is to say a huge thank you to our guest, Ellen, for joining us and providing such valuable and interesting insights. So you've been listening to the TDS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Ellen Sandseter. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, and I'm sure you have, Don't forget that you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access all of the exclusive follow-up content, which includes ideas for your setting and Pinterest boards that will help you to shop resources that are really good for learning through risk.